The former nation of Czechoslovakia had one of the most interesting and vibrant animation industries, with plenty of international success. The 1970s were a time of increased political oppression and censorship in Czechoslovakia, but there were still plenty of filmmakers making incredibly creative works. These include a variety of genres and styles, both traditional and stop-motion animation, commercial and experimental films, and works aimed at both children and adults. The animation of the era was mostly shorts and TV, but a couple of features came out as well. The most famous animated film to be produced in Czechoslovakia in the 70s was the cult classic Fantastic Planet. It was made by French director René Laloux, who went on to direct more cult animated films like Time Masters and Gandahar. The film also has designs from famous French illustrator Roland Topor, but besides them, basically all of the crew members during production were Czech. The sci-fi film is set in the distant future with giant blue-skinned aliens who either keep humans as pets or think of them as vermin to be exterminated. Fantastic Planet is definitely not for children, as it's somewhat disturbing in its cold depiction of the aliens murdering the humans. It's also trippy and psychedelic, with bizarre aliens, surreal meditation rituals, and a jazz-funk soundtrack. The score is one of the most memorable parts of the film, and has been sampled by multiple hip-hop artists in the following decades. The film in general fits in perfectly with the psychedelic hippie era of the 60s and 70s, and parts of it can definitely be seen as having a drug-related subtext. While the animation is often limited, the designs are undeniably striking and unique. This simple but clearly allegorical story is often viewed as being about animal rights, presenting the idea that humans may not like being treated that way if the shoe was on the other foot. However, there are certain aspects of the film that make it applicable to civil rights in general, with unmistakable references to slavery and the Holocaust, like humans being gassed to death. The themes of the film could be applied to racism, colonialism, and any other form of oppression. People have also found connections between the plot and the biblical story of Exodus. The characters aren't well fleshed out, and this is a film more about ideas than individuals. Fantastic Planet is also quite serious, with very few moments of humor. Fantastic Planet had a lengthy production and took 5 years to make, partly because the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia in the middle of production. The film was shown at Cannes and won the special prize there. It's also one of the very few animated films to be released as part of the Criterion Collection, and it was picked by Rolling Stone as one of the top 40 science fiction films ever made, including both live action and animation. The most internationally well-known animator from Czechoslovakia is easily Jan Švankmajer, whose career started in the 1960s. Švankmajer was an avowed surrealist who made dark, unsettling films that often combined live action and stop motion. His work is highly stylized and has a very distinct and recognizable look and feel. He often used rapid editing to create dense films that were highly structured and utilized cycles and repetition. Sadly, he was banned by the government from making films for most of the decade, but he still managed to put out a few shorts. Švankmajer began the decade with Jabberwocky. It's inspired by the 1871 Lewis Carroll nonsense poem of the same name, which is read over the opening scene. A common theme in Švankmajer's films is objects coming to life, and here that happens with dolls and toys. Clothes get up and dance, and branches take over the room. As usual with Švankmajer, things get dark, like when a bunch of small dolls bust out of the body of a bigger one. Like many of his short films of the 60s, Jabberwocky is built around a repetitive cycle where every couple of minutes or so a maze fills the screen before being knocked over by a black cat. As was common with surrealists, Švankmajer was influenced by Freud and psychoanalysis. He called this film a, quote, Freudian record of a child through all its stages. Of course, the work of Lewis Carroll itself was also a precursor to surrealism. As was the case with multiple other Švankmajer films, it was eventually banned by the government. In his next short, Leonardo's Diary, Švankmajer combined 2D animation based on Da Vinci's art with live action, specifically stock footage of things like bombs being dropped from an airplane or a boxing match. It was different from the style he's famous for, although using both live action and animation in the same film was definitely something he never shied away from. The short was shown at Cannes and eventually criticized in the Czechoslovakian press for not promoting socialism. This led to increased attention from the censors for any following films. Švankmajer's metafictional short Castle of Otranto consists of black and white live action combined with color cutout animation, and is loosely based on a 1764 Gothic novel by Robert Walpole. The animation gives us the story of the novel, while in a parody of documentaries, the live-action scenes depict a reporter interviewing a professor who claims the titular castle was actually in Czechoslovakia, not Italy. This one is also quite different from his usual style. It doesn't have the rapid editing he often uses. This time, the censors didn't like that Švankmajer was going to use a real well-known television reporter, thinking that this might make people doubt what they saw on the news. His unwillingness to agree to the demand to change the film resulted in his ban from filmmaking entirely. Another very important director, but one with a very different style, was Karel Zeman. He had already been very successful in the 50s and 60s, with multiple highly stylized features that combined animation and live action for a distinctive, inventive look that often resembles silent cinema. These films were successful internationally and would influence later directors like Terry Gilliam and Tim Burton. However, he changed his style up in the 70s, eventually moving to fully animated films. His first film of the decade was On the Comet, done in his standard style of mixing live action with animated environments. Like many of Zeman's films, it's a sci-fi movie based on a Jules Verne novel. A comet collides with the Earth, carrying a section of it off into space. The section happens to be a French colony in northern Africa, and the various nationalities are all stuck together and fight amongst themselves. The fighting is used, as Zeman often did, to mock the absurdity of war and imperialism. In addition to the petty bickering between ethnicities, the colony even inexplicably gets attacked by dinosaurs created with stop motion, and other monsters like a giant serpent appear as well. This is one of Zeman's less appreciated films, and is not as loved as his features from the 50s and 60s. Like with Fantastic Planet, the 1968 Soviet invasion took place during production. The new regime didn't care much for Zeman, and this would be the final live-action film he was allowed to make. Starting with his next film, 1001 Nights, also known as The Adventures of Sinbad the Sailor, Zeman's work would be entirely animation. The episodic movie was first produced as shorts before being compiled into a feature. The film follows Sinbad through various adventures like dealing with giants and riding a magic carpet. While not made in Zeman's usual way, it still retains a bit of that feel in that it's a mix of 2D paper cutouts and 3D animation, as well as through the use of things like real smoke and water. Sequences are also introduced storybook-style borders, strengthening the fairy tale-like feel of the film. His next film, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, also used cutout animation and came out in 1978. Adapted from a book that was itself based on Slavic folklore, it tells the story of a boy who ends up an apprentice to an evil sorcerer that transforms children into animals. The film is set in the 17th century, and like the folktale, takes place in the historical region of Lusatia, which today straddles the border of Germany and Poland. The Sorcerer's Apprentice is darker than usual for Zeman, as the villain has no problems killing his pupils. On the other hand, one director whose career was just beginning in the 70s was Jiří Barta, later known for stop-motion feature films such as The Pied Piper and Toys in the Attic. However, his debut Riddles for a Candy is in a completely different style. It does use stop motion, but looks nothing like those films, and combines the stop motion with traditional animation. The short is also not nearly as dark or unsettling as his later work. There's also American Gene Deitch, who moved to Czechoslovakia in the early 60s before working on Tom and Jerry, and then directed several animated shorts in the 1970s. His films of the 70s were mostly silly or quirky little shorts and some adaptations of children's books. Deitch's 1970 short The Giants is a biting satirical film where two men, one almost solid red and the other almost solid blue, call upon giants of the same color to fight a proxy battle for them. It's an obvious metaphor for small countries getting involved with the major global powers. The mixed media short edits in clips of live-action violence to drive the point home. After that, Deitch directed a much more lighthearted short called The Foolish Frog. The whole thing is built around a song from American folk singer Pete Seeger, who gained fame in the 1940s. The 1972 short The Three Robbers was one of many Deitch directed for the American company Weston Woods over the course of several decades. Also for Weston Woods was Harold's Fairy Tale, which adapts the Harold and the Purple Crayon series of picture books that began in 1955. Deitch followed that up with another book adaptation, Where the Wild Things Are, a short that closely follows Maurice Sendak's story. He ended the decade with the simple joke short Smile for Auntie, where a poor child is harangued by his annoying relative. One important director from the early years of Czech animation, still active in the 70s, was Hermína Týrlová, who made shorts using wool and other fuzzy materials. In the 70s, she directed a series of stop-motion films featuring Ferda the Ant, a Czech anthropomorphic ant character that originated in comics from the 1930s. Týrlová actually used the character in her very first film all the way back in 1944. Another well-known animator of the era was Bretislav Pojar, and he made multiple wordless shorts in the 70s using both 2D and 3D animation. Pojar used traditional animation in Babalok to tell a clearly metaphorical story where rectangular and spherical people fight each other. His short The Apple Tree Maiden used a combination of 2D and 3D animation to depict a medieval setting and look. But Pojar returned to entirely 2D animation in Boom, which tells the story of warfare from caveman to medieval times, and eventually shows hot air balloons and tanks. On top of all that, Pojar was the main creative force behind the TV show Hey Mr. Let's Play, about two bear brothers portrayed by puppets. It started airing in the 60s, but made it into the mid-70s. Director Zdeněk Smetana made a couple of quirky shorts in the late 70s, like the intentionally simplistic and flat-looking films Of All Sorts from 1978 and End of Cube in 1979. Also making minimalist short films was director Václav Bedřich. His 1974 film Beer Over the Street takes place in a very basic environment with mostly black line drawings and white backgrounds. His 1976 short Kashtanka, adapted from a Chekhov short story, was more detailed but still quite flat and far from realistic. Director Jiří Barta has been involved in the Czech animation industry since the 1940s, and he was still active in the 1970s. Two of his shorts of the decade were based on folk songs. There was A Miller on a River from 1971 and The Miner's Rose from 1974. He also adapted Oscar Wilde's 1888 children's story The Happy Prince in his short What I Haven't Told the Prince. Václav Mergel began his career in the 70s and directed a couple of dark, surreal, dialogue-free sci-fi shorts. Laocoon tells the story of astronauts encountering amoebas who pretend to be valuable gems with cutout animation. Next, his short Crabs is a creepy allegory where a military scientist creates robot crabs that eat metal and create new robots on their own. Of course, things go wrong when the crabs just keep getting bigger and turn on their creator. An interesting curiosity is Dagmar Dubkova's About Dressy Sally, made in 1976. It gained notoriety as it was thought to be lost and was the subject of a years-long internet search. It was supposedly aired on the children's cable channel Nickelodeon in the 1980s, then mentioned online in 2012, leading to a 5-year hunt with several false leads. About Dressy Sally is oddly creepy, but not nearly as creepy as the description that kicked off the search indicated. The creepiness comes from a wizard watching a little girl from far away in order to make sure she follows his instructions. But the presentation is lighthearted. The short is done in a flat, basic style with limited animation. Slovakian animation was starting to come into its own in the 1970s, and the most important pioneering director was Viktor Kubal. In the 70s, he made multiple comedic dialogue-free shorts, like Two Good Friends and Johnny the Pea and the Bacilli, both animated in a loose, undetailed style. His short Kino also had a minimal, sketched-out style and parodies various movie genres. In 1976, Kubal directed Jerko the Outlaw, which was the first feature-length animation from Slovakia. Impressively, Kubal made almost the entire film himself, but this was made easier by Kubal's way of working that was the complete opposite of perfectionism. He was known for working very fast and changing things up on the fly. Based on a folktale, the title character, a folk hero bandit, robs from the rich and gives to the poor, in a film that mixes several genres and modes, including musical, comedy, and myth. The flowy style of the characters reminded me of another 1970s animated film from Central Europe, and that's Johnny Corncob from Hungarian director Marcel Jankovic. I don't know if Kubal was aware of Jankovic's work, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was an influence there. Another Slovakian short was Vlastimil Harold's Little Mouse Cooked a Gruel, which has an extremely unrealistic and flat look. Ivan Popovich's 1979 Slovakian short film Dream the Guard contains a bit of live action in the beginning and end, but is mostly three-dimensional stop motion with puppets and toy blocks. In addition to the features and short films, there were several animated TV shows being aired in Czechoslovakia in the 1970s as well. The most popular animated series created in the 70s was Pat and Matt, a dialogue-free show about two bald men getting in an endless series of disasters around the house. Episodes center around them dealing with some sort of problem that the duo inevitably make worse through their lack of common sense, yet they always remain cheerful. Despite the series' complete lack of political content, the series still faced censorship issues. The censors didn't like that the main characters wore red and yellow, as they thought this meant the duo represented the USSR and China. Pat and Matt has lasted quite a long time, with episodes still being made today, and there was even a theatrical feature film in 2016. Another very famous series was The Little Mole. The title character was created in the 50s in a short film, and the TV series began in the 60s and continued into the 70s and beyond. Like Pat and Matt, the series had no dialogue in order to appeal to an international audience. This, in addition to the big-eyed, cute designs of the characters, made the show quite popular even outside of the Eastern Bloc. Amolka the Fairy began airing on Czechoslovakian television in 1973 and is about a forest fairy. In the first episode, she uses her magic powers to play tricks on a hunter and save a fawn. The series has developed a cult following in Japan. There was also Fig the Maxi Dog, a show about a giant dog. This is just scratching the surface of the very interesting world of Czechoslovakian animation, so I hope this has inspired you to look into it more. I also did a similar video in the 1960s, and I'm making a video on Czechoslovakian animation as a whole next. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe.